Hey, what's going on everyone? Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be refreshing the suspension components on the S4, including the upper and lower control arms, as well as the end links and the tie rods. Let's get started. Okay, so looking at our kit here, you can see that it includes the front sway bar link, both the lower control arms, both the upper control arms, as well as the tie rod end. One thing you don't see here, but I do have here on the side, is all new hardware. And that's something that people often forget when they're doing all this suspension work. Most, if not all, of the hardware that goes onto the control arms and the links is single-use hardware that you do need to replace after every time it's removed. So just make sure that you go ahead and get new hardware or order a kit that comes with new hardware. Okay, so quick note here. Before we even jack up our car and put it on jack stand securely and remove our wheel, before all that, I definitely recommend you guys go ahead and get some penetrating oil, whatever you like to use. I love to use this stuff. It works very well. And then just spray all these bolts. If you haven't touched them in a while, this is almost like a requirement, or else you're going to spend the whole day here trying to break free some rusty bolts, or even, go ahead and break some bolts and make your life even harder during this process. So a couple days before, just go ahead and spray these down a few times, drive on them, whatever it be, and it'll definitely help you out when you're ready to remove all these control arms. Now that you've done that, we can now jack up the car, secure it with jack stands and make sure they're secure, and just give the car a little shake, make sure it's not going anywhere so that you don't have this falling on you. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and remove this pinch bolt and get started on the upper control arms. This is one of those that you want to spray ahead of time because these get seized in even after you spray. If these haven't been chained in a long time, sometimes the bolts rust in their path here and you'll have to use a torch and an air hammer to get them out. Luckily, I've taken these out a couple times in the last year, so shouldn't be much of an issue. So we'll grab two 16mm wrenches, one on this side to hold the nut steady and the one on the other side to crank it loose. Now once you got this nut out, you can go ahead and pull this bolt out. Again, if yours is seized in, you might have to grab some channel locks or some pliers to finish pulling this out. There we go. Now that that pinch bolt is out, our control arm should be loose here at the bolt joint. So we can take a rubber mallet and then just hammer them out here. There goes one. This one's a little harder because you have less leverage. And there goes two. Now that we're done up front, we'll move on to the back here. And what we're going to do here is the same process as front. It's two 16mm wrenches. And crank on that to get that loose. Now once you get that loose, get that nut out of there. And then we'll pull the bolt out. Now, if you've never done this before, or the person who did it before hated themselves or the future owner, this bolt would be facing towards the car, which will make it impossible to take out unless you remove the 3 bolts at the top of the strut tower, pull the strut tower forwards to then be able to pull this bolt out. So just keep that in mind. You might have to remove these 3 bolts if this has never been done before, or the person who did do it before didn't care enough to reverse these bolts. I would take the time now and make these bolts face what I think is the right way. So on the right side here, facing the front of the car, it'd be going in from the coil over here towards the front of the car. And on the opposite side, it'd be doing the same thing here, coming from the back of the car towards the front. This way it's very easy to remove next time you have to go ahead and do this, which I hope isn't very soon. Now after that bolt is removed, this should slide right out. And what I recommend you do here now is inspect this, see how it looked. Mine had a couple little, not tears, but close to tearing. And the bushings actually looked okay, but we're still gonna replace these. So we'll grab this same control arm. If you've never done this before, the 2 front control arms are a little different. There is this curved control arm here, and then the straighter control arm goes to the front of the car. But at this point, we'll just replace them one at a time to make things easier. So grab the one that looks exactly like the one you removed and place it where you took it from. Okay, so now we'll just grab our new control arm and slide it in here. and we'll go ahead and grab our new hardware. For the new hardware, there's no need to do any Loctite or anything like that. As you can see, this nut is ovaled, and the point of that is to create a bit more friction between the nut and the threads on the bolt, so that way these will never back out. So when you go ahead and order your control arm kit or your hardware kit, make sure you look at the images, or just make sure you buy some good quality hardware that'll have this feature in it. Now, once you got your control arm in there and your new hardware in hand, go ahead and slide the bolt through here. And you'll want to come here on the other side and put your nut in. And then we'll go ahead and start tightening this. One thing you want to keep in mind when tightening is you don't want to tighten this all the way. We're just going to tighten it so we have good thread engagement and a bit of friction when we're moving up and down. These have to get tightened with the suspension at about operating height, and I'll show you how to do that later on. Okay, so you can see the point to where we tighten this new control arm here. It moves freely up and down, but won't fall on its own. And that's what we want right now. So we'll leave that up here hanging, hold itself up, and we'll move on to the other side. Same process. We'll loosen up the bolt, pull it out, and replace the other control arm. Pull this control arm out. In your kit, there should be 2 of these control arms with the bend in them. When you grab them, you'll see that they're a little different. So we have the one that goes on this side here. You'll see it lines up perfectly and it matches exactly to what we have. And then we have the one for the other side, which curves in the opposite direction. So when you grab them, you got to make sure you grab the right one. So we'll put this one back. And this is the one we're going to be using. As you can see, they match perfectly. So we'll go ahead and slide our new control arm in. We'll also grab our new hardware. And remember, this one's going to be inserted from this side with the space here towards the back of the car. And insert it towards the front of the car through the control arm here. And we'll get the nut in on the other side. And we'll go ahead and tighten this down just like we did before. Again, remembering not to tighten this down too much. We're just tightening so that we have a bit of friction and the control arm holds itself up. And nothing crazy here on the grease, just a little around the end here. And that should be fine. Now that this is greased up, we'll go ahead and move our control arms into place here. See, that one's locked in, and we'll grab the hammer from before and then just tap them into place. Now we'll move on to the other one here. Alright, once you hammer those in, it's time to put our new pinch bolt in. And this is one of those pieces of hardware that you definitely want to get a new one for. And when we're putting in the new one, we'll actually grab some anti-seize and just rub it onto the bolt here, just on this part. This is the part that tends to seize in. So we'll go ahead, rub that all around there. And that'll just ensure that in the future we don't have any issues with removing this bolt if we have to. Now we'll go ahead and slide that in. Once that's in, we'll thread in the bolt on the other side. Now this bolt, we don't have to wait till we get to the correct height to go ahead and pinch in. So we'll go ahead and just give this a couple cranks. Make sure it's tight. Again, nothing crazy here. That oval tip on the nut will hold this bolt in. Now that the upper control arms are in and installed, we'll go ahead and move on to the tie rod. So first thing we have to do is remove this 16mm nut here. Then we'll move to the top where we have this 13mm that has to come out as well. Now, one thing we'll want to do before we go ahead and remove this 13mm nut is hammer out this here. If it doesn't hammer out easily, we have one of two issues. One, either the bolt is seized in here, or two, this tie rod end actually spins. And inside, when it spins, it locks this bolt in so this can't come out. So what you want to do is try to loosen the top bolt a little bit and then go at it with a hammer and try to hammer the bolt out the other end here. And you'll see that that'll come out at some point here. But you'll see here when we start spinning, you'll see the bottom of the tie rod spin a little there. Now, since the tie rod end is spinning, what you want to do here is crank at it and push the bolt in from the back side where it was and push in. So while you're pushing in, go ahead and turn the tie rod and you'll see that the bolt will start to slide in. Once you see it slide in this much, not all the way through, you can go ahead and fully loosen your tie rod there. You'll see it go. And once you have this bolt out of the top, now we can go ahead and remove this one here. So there's one of two ways to do that. Either we could just punch it out really quickly, or you can grab a pair of pliers and pull it out of the back end. So I'll grab a punch and just punch it out. Now that that's removed, we go back to our mallet here. And what you want to do is pull down on the tie rod end. And this one you might have to hit a bit harder than usual. And you'll start to see it come down. There you go. Wipe off the grease that I had there before. Again, I greased this up just so I didn't have any issues with pulling it out. But you can go ahead and replace the grease for some anti-seize, and that'll work just as well. Now, on the back of the tie rod, you will see a spot to put a 22mm wrench in. What we want to do here is now go ahead and put your tie rod back into place and just tap it in a little. It's just meant to hold itself in place here while we go ahead and try to loosen the 22mm back here. So you go ahead and grab that and then just loosen that up. This one shouldn't be too tight. Once you get that loose, just keep going at it. Then you should be able to just hammer the tie rod out and spin it away here. And we got our tie rod out. So now here, there's two things we have to know. First of all, how bad was your tie rod? Mine was actually in pretty good condition, so no tears or anything, not leaking. A little loose, but not bad. And this was actually the OEM tie rod, so that had been there for a while. Now, the second thing we want to do is just see the placement of these threads here. We moved these a couple, so I'll go ahead and forward this a bit, but you want to have a good idea of where it is. So that way when you put it back in, you're at about a decent alignment level before you go ahead and take your car in for an alignment, since you'll most likely have to drive it there. Now, moving on to installing the tie rod, there's something we have to do. So I actually added a bit of white out here just to mark my spot to where this nut was. This nut doesn't come included in most kits. So once you've marked where you are, you'll want to back out here. And once you back that all the way out, grab your new tie rod end and start feeding that nut in. And now once you think you got it close, what we have to do is this. So we're actually going to line up this area on each of the tie rods and then just turn down the nut to where just about at where we marked, which will be right around here for me. Now once we're there, we can go ahead and feed our new tie rod in. Now once you get your tie rod on, it should line up just about with where we were before. If it doesn't, you can back off this nut, move back or forward a few threads, whatever you think you have to adjust in your situation. But before, and then we can go ahead and tap our tie rod in. But before we do that, I'm gonna add a little anti-seize here and just spread that around. We're all set there, and we'll go ahead and hammer this in. Now once we're in, we can feed our new hardware through, starting with the top bolt. Another quick note, if you don't feel like turning this nut to spin the tie rod. There is actually an Allen head in the tie rod end where you can go ahead and take it and turn it. On old ones, I don't recommend you do that because that might be rusty and you might strip it out. So it's easier to go ahead and take the top nut and spin it that way. On the new ones, you can go ahead and spin it from the Allen head inside, but I'm just gonna take it just like I did before. Start tightening here. You could also look in with the flashlight and see when the notch lines up so you can put your new bolt through. So you see here we have a new bolt with the flat head here, and we'll feed that in through the back. And we'll go ahead and thread our new nut in as well. If you do use an impact wrench, do not over tighten these. Now once you have this tightened, we can go ahead and tighten the top. And just like all the other ones, no need to go too tight here, just one good crank, and we're all set. Now we've gone ahead and refreshed all the suspension components up top, including the upper control arms and the tie rod. Now we'll go move on to the bottom to remove the lower control arms. All right, so now we are working on the front lower control arm. And the first thing we're gonna do is remove the brace here for the coilover from the control arm. So this is an 18 mil, and there's an 18 millimeter nut on the other side. So we'll get a wrench in to hold that nut. And we're actually gonna get our impact in here to remove the bolt. Next thing we have here is our front sway bar end link. So we'll go ahead and remove it from the control arm first, and then we'll move down to the sway bar. These are both 16s. Now we'll move on to the bottom bolt on the end link. So I actually had to go in there with the impact to get this off because whoever decided to install this last tightened this too much. And as you can see there, bushing's a little shot as well. Now we'll move on to the rear bolt here on the back of the control arm. These I have a strong feeling are going to be a pain in the ass. So we're actually going to go ahead and grab our breaker bar for these. Okay, so these will be 218s. So we'll go ahead and, of course I'm not going to be able to fit that in there. Okay, so no breaker bar for me. Alright, so we'll just go at this with the ratchet and the 18 mil wrench on the other side. And hopefully we can break this loose. It won't even budge. Alright, so after a lot of wrestling, I was able to crack this open. We can go ahead and remove this bolt now. So the other side of this, which is where the nut goes, is rusted bad enough to where I got half of the bolt off and it just seized upon itself. So the threads on the bolt were just too far gone. So we're actually gonna have to take the Dremel and cut it out. Okay, so after a bunch of yelling, cutting, cursing, a couple tears, a little bit of blood, we finally got the nut out that holds that bolt for the rear of the front control arm. Okay, so now that we have the bolt that was holding the control arm to the subframe out, we will work on removing the control arm from the steering knuckle here. So what we'll do is grab an 18 mil and get that bolt from the bottom. We're gonna have to crack that one loose. Okay, so that's the job for the breaker bar. And this is that nut that we just removed from here. Now that we got that on, it's time to push the control arm out. So again, we'll bring out the rubber mallet and we're gonna hit this bolt that's coming out, which is attached to the control arm. All right, so job for the bigger hammer. And there you go. That drop there means that control arm is removed. Now we'll finish removing this bolt, which was the one holding in the rest of the control arm there. Okay, and now that we finally got that bolt out that holds the control arm to the subframe, we can go ahead and hammer that down as well. This control arm is probably seized in a bit. Pretty sure this one's never been replaced. Alright, and trying to hammer down the control arm, we see that we're hitting the sway bar here. And in the hopes of not having to remove this, what we're going to do is actually move over to the other control arm, remove that, and then that'll let the suspension drop. So let's get started on that. Alright, so good news and bad news. Bad news is that removing the other control arm didn't drop the suspension enough to allow us to remove this control arm from the spindle. But what we're going to do is just remove one of the end links on the other side, which will allow us to rotate the control arm out of the way, pound this down, and then give us enough motion to bring this control arm up and out of its spot. So I'm going to go remove that end link on the other side first. Alright, so now that the end link is loose on the other side, we can go ahead and rotate the sway bar, get that out of the way, and then we can go ahead and hammer this. That control arm's out of the way, and that piece comes off too. Now our bottom control arms are out. And now moving to the other control arm, and sorry I can't show you the bolt on this one here, but it's another 18 mil that we're gonna have to loosen. This one's at the top of the control arm where it meets the spindle. So we're gonna loosen that one. Alright, so we cracked that nut loose. Go ahead and remove that. That's gone. We have to start working on this now. So this is the bolt that holds this rearmost control arm onto the subframe. This one's probably going to be the same story as the other. Probably going to be very rusty, so it'll be a pain in the butt to remove. So let's get started. So that one moved much easier than the last. Alright, so we got this bolt out too. And for this one we ran into the same issue as the other. So I had to go ahead and take the Dremel and cut a slit there. And that slit just relieved pressure, allowed the bolt to go through the nut, even with all the corrosion it had. If it wasn't for that cut, I don't think I would have been able to get that one out. You could see how the cut's already all full of corrosion too, as it was pushed out through the threads. Okay, so here we run into our next dilemma, and that is this bolt here. So this bolt hits the body of the car when you're trying to pull it out from here. So we have two options here. The correct way to do this is to go ahead and drop the subframe a bit, and that'll allow you to pull this bolt out. I really don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is, because I have new hardware, I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and we're actually going to feed the bolt through the other side when we reinstall it. Alright, so we've gone ahead and cut the head off of that inner bolt. Now what we're going to do is actually free our control arm from the spindle here. So we're going to hammer down. And we're going to just pry the rest of the way. And since we cut the head off of the end of this bolt, we're able to feed it into the subframe here and get it out through the access hole that they give us. There goes the bolt, and there goes the control arm. So we'll start off exactly where we ended, and we'll grab the new one of the lower control arm here. Again, just compare, make sure everything looks identical before you put them back in. So first, we'll actually go ahead and slide this side in here. And this one, I'm gonna go ahead and just put a little bit of anti-seize here to make sure we don't have any issues with this seizing into the spot where it was before. All right, so we'll go ahead and feed that in to the ball joint socket. Now that we have this control arm in its ball joint here, we're gonna thread in the nut that goes at the bottom here. Again, remember to use new hardware for this. These nuts are gonna be the ones with the big built-in washer at the bottom. Once you fed that in, we're going to move on to securing the control arm into its location at the subframe here. And to do that, we brought out the jack, and we actually have to jack the suspension up a bit so it lines up correctly. And for the suspension to go up correctly, we actually have to first go ahead and attach this nut here, which will link the rest of the suspension with the coilover. So you see there, when we're jacking it up, lines things up a bit. So we're gonna drop that, grab the new hardware. Okay, so we got the new hardware here. Gonna put some anti-seize on this part of the bolt. I'm gonna go ahead, jack up just a little more so it can line up correctly. And we'll feed our bolt through here. And get our nut in on the other side. Once we have that threaded in, we'll move on to getting the control arm onto the subframe. So on the subframe, you'll see that there's two spots where you can go ahead and put your control arm. We're gonna put it in the innermost spot. So we're gonna go ahead, jack this up a little more. And you'll see there, the control arm will start rising. Lock the jack in there, and then we'll slide it in here. Now it's time to get the new hardware into our control arm here. And this is going to be the shorter of the two lower control arm bolts. And for this bolt, when you're going to feed it in, you have to feed it into the motor mount bracket first, then into the hole that's going to hold here for the subframe. And then we got to wiggle our control arm here to try to get the right spot for it. All right, now we got that control arm through. Okay, now we move on to our other control arm here. So for this one, we're going to follow pretty much the same process. We're going to feed the ball joint here into the spindle, and then we're going to work on feeding the bushing back into its place here. So let's get started on the spindle first, and just like the other one, we'll add a little bit of anti-seize just to make sure we don't have any issues later. Now we'll feed the control arm into its joint here. And we'll also get that nut threaded in. Remember, these are the ones with the large washer built into them. Now that the ball joint is connected, we'll go ahead and move on to putting the bushing into its correct spot here. So just like the frontmost lower control arm, for this one there are two spots. We're going to use the rear spot here as well. And we're going to grab our bolt for this control arm. This one we're going to feed through the subframe here and back into the control arm. And this is the longer of the two bolts for the control arm, so remember that. And once that's in, we'll get our nut in here as well. Now we can go ahead and tighten all the hardware. Here, we're gonna go, just like we did at the upper control arms, these are gonna go snug, but not tight enough to where they can't move, both sides. And for the ball joints here, we could just tighten these all the way. Okay, so once we have all four control arms in and all the ball joints for the control arm secured, so you have that pinch bolt up top and then the two bolts on the spindle here at the bottom, we'll move on to installing our sway bar end links. So when you're looking at the end links here, you'll see there's one side that has a bit of a metal bulge on one end. This is going towards the sway bar. It also should be going in the C pattern here behind the control arm. The link itself towards the front, and we'll feed the bolt through here at the top. And then we'll have the bolt at the bottom here, which will go through the sway bar itself. Remember, we removed the link on the other side for the sway bar, so they should be easier to move. And we'll go ahead and feed that other bolt through the bottom there as well. Once we have both of those fed, we can go ahead and thread our nuts in. And just like the other ones, we'll get these snug but not tight. Remember that these have bushings, so they have to get tightened at ride height. All right, so now we move into the last step, which is bringing this all up to what ride height would be. So this is just an estimate, but we're gonna jack the suspension up here. So we're just gonna place the jack right behind the brake rotor here and jack this up to just about where ride height would be, which in my case would be just about here, actually a little higher. Now that we have the suspension at ride height, we'll go ahead and tighten all the bolts that had bushings, and we'll start with the top two control arms here. So we'll grab our two 16 mil wrenches and then just crank this so that it's nice and tight. Now that both of those are tight, we'll move on to the control arms at the bottom and get those tight as well. All right, and we'll start with this control arm here. All right, and we'll just crank that out too here. And all set for the bottom there as well. All right, everyone, so first of all, if you stuck it through till now, kudos to you, because this was a really long video. Suspension work is some of the most time-consuming, tedious, and most involved jobs you can do on a car, but it's very much worth it, even if it leads to messed up fingers like that. This is one of those jobs that you have to tackle on a high-mileage car. These control arms wear out over time, and with this car with over 200,000 miles, and the lower control arms had never been changed by the previous owner. So the car drives like a dream now. It's completely different. The handling is completely different. And one other thing to note, once you do get this done, you have to go to a shop and get an alignment done. And make sure you just go to a good shop that knows what they're doing, has worked on these cars before, and get a proper alignment done. If you don't, your car will not ride correctly. You'll have pulling, you might be out of tow, and several other things. So you don't want to have to deal with issues on your ride. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe during these very trying times. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.